Good afternoon. I don't know, do we have anyone joining remotely or it's just, we can't tell, right? It's just recording.
No, it's just a recording.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm really glad to have you all here going through a conversation today that I'm really grateful to be here with you all for, which is obviously you see in the title that it has discussion because we're in a small group. It can be just a point of reflection rather than discussion. So there will be a lot of educational tools throughout this deck. But it'll be equal parts educational and reflection based, hopefully. So I've presented this at work before, but this is the first time that I'm presenting it in front of people versus remotely. And as you can see, I was the class of 2016, which means that I overlapped with, I think all of you, maybe, did we overlap with 2019?
Yeah,
Yes.
it would have been, you would have been a senior.
I would have been a senior, thank you. Okay, perfect. So, let's see.
It didn't work.
It didn't, that's okay.
Cindy's got it.
Okay, so a little bit about me, class of 2016. I was a sociology and Spanish double major. I heard, in case there were any current students here, I had heard that last night was senior ball, so I included the senior ball pictures here. Once I heard that this morning, I was like, let me pull these into the presentation because I give you all so much credit for being here. That was a really fun night, and you'll recognize some folks in there. I don't want to show them out, but it's crazy to think that even in this lower picture, some of these friends are already married. And then this was my roommate, Carla, and I at the Women in Business Conference in 2015. Unsure of what the future held, but here we are all these years later and everything's working out fine. And then I also have in the bottom of it, really proud day, especially as a first generation college student, of graduating from Holy Cross with my degree. And then that's my sister by my side who you might recognize. She was here as the class of 2017. So that's a little bit about my time at Holy Cross. My majors as sociology and Spanish double major, who also spent a year abroad in Spain, really helped me to unpack parts of my own identity, as well as learning a lot about the different people that I met here. So that really inspired me in what I knew I wanted to do post-college. I really loved the conversations that we were having, especially in sociology classes, about inequity and intersectionality and privilege permeating society. So in talking to mentors and everything throughout my Holy Cross experience, I knew that I wanted to get into HR work after college. And then I took a quick detour in Washington, D.C., where I ended up spending the next 6 years. By chance, I took an Italian class my spring semester senior year, and then applied to a fellowship through that class, where I ended up working for my local congresswoman for 3 months, and then pivoting into HR work, in recruiting, in operational work, and then most recently in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which I felt really, fulfills me and empowers me with what I've learned here at Holy Cross in terms of being a man or woman for and with others. Okay, so, just next slide. Yeah, perfect. So why does this topic matter? These are a few pictures I pulled from the Holy Cross site, and then I pulled the description of this event today in honoring 50 years of women being on campus. So that is what I pulled from what looked like the first class of women here on the campus. And then this was, I was trying to find a similar picture to today. This, I believe, was from the campus community page to show that in the past 50 years, there are areas in which we've come so far. But then at the same time, there's a lot that we have to do, and there's a lot of progress that can be made. So it's simultaneously celebrating how the progress we've made and how far we've come, while also committing to the work that continues to need to be done to make sure that everyone feels a feeling of inclusion and belonging on campus. Okay, so these are just a few ground rules. And again, this is from giving this presentation in the discussion format that we usually have, but today we'll be a little bit more reflective as we go through the slides. With the ground rules, these are always important to ground us in because these conversations, you know, if you've been in the classroom or even at work in employee resource groups, you know that these conversations don't come naturally. They can be a little uncomfortable, confronting common workplace biases. So the purpose of today's discussion is to really have a constructive conversation where we focus on understanding each other's perspectives and experiences without fear of judgment. And so hopefully these slides that we go through today will empower you to have these conversations in your place of work, in your community. It really comes down to making sure that we're exercising reasonable judgment, realizing where we are, that some of us have a little bit more to learn than others, and that's okay, and being supportive in that journey. And then also remembering to treat others with respect, mutual understanding, and patience, but to pull from conversations that we've heard earlier in the day. I know being especially within this Holy Cross community, that we're all here because we share that similar purpose and vision. So these are just a few reminders about that. These are also some tips about great ways to engage in conversation. So these are, again, when I present for the workplace. For students, I know there are a lot of resources on campus that we may have participated in when we were on campus as young alum. But recognizing when someone has shared something difficult, so thanking them for that, for their vulnerability, avoiding labeling words such as good and right or bad or wrong, and really allowing people to arrive as their authentic selves. Realizing again that, these types of conversations can get uncomfortable, emotions can get high, knowing when to take a step back and think about the purpose of the discussion and having constructive conversations. And as we get a little bit more through the presentation, we'll talk about tips on how to approach that. Perfect. So just like a campus class syllabus, this is what we expect to achieve today, is to build awareness around common biases that women may experience at work, finding ways to label those, having a discussion, sharing observations, and exploring why it matters. Practicing with some scenarios. So we'll watch a few videos, but then we'll also have a chance where we can identify and figure out what the bias is and determine how to support your colleague in that moment, in that example. And then we'll think about how we can promote further awareness and conversations around women in the workplace in a strive to improve, you know, looking back 50 years, the next 50 years and beyond. Okay, so I'll just give a minute to read these. These are just to kind of put us in a place to be thinking of maybe something if these quotes resonate with you. If you know someone that they resonate with. I know we don't have any students in the audience, so maybe it's within your jobs if you heard some of these stories. And just looking them over and thinking if any of these resonate with you or if you've heard similar stories from mentors in your life, other women within your workplace, or anything else. You switch to the next one. Thank you. So now let's think about what types of bias against women and gender minorities can you think of? And I'll ask if anybody wants to raise their hand and share, you definitely can. But again, sorry, go ahead.
That women are too emotional and that's why we shouldn't promote them to leadership positions.
Yeah, that's a good one. That comes up, especially from my HR background, hearing that when it comes to performance review time, like if that shows up in a performance review. talking about emotions or personality traits that we know are used sometimes to box women into certain categories, right, wrong, bad, wrong.
Oh, do I have to raise my hand?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, actually, you can just
Me.
go.
The way you like use your voice at work, so like men are in charge if they're very forthright, but women are perceived as being too forthcoming or need to like tone down your voice and like put it in a nice way and like
Yeah.
being coached on that.
Yeah,
The way you even say the same exact thing.
definitely. I think that calls back to what we heard earlier today in the keynote, was that comes down to exclamation points or that dichotomy of, if I do act a certain way, you're going to label me as such, but if I don't, then you're looking for why I'm not acting the way that you expect me to. Good example. I promise I didn't plant these two.
At my job, we also talk about how like women are often recognized or like perceived as being better at like so-called like soft skills. And then
Mhm.
men are recognized for and are perceived as being better at like the, analytical type like metric stuff. And we've noticed that's like come up in performance reviews that like women get told like, oh, she's a great team player, and men get like, oh, he was like the number 2 person for this metric, led the team in this metric, et cetera.
Totally. That's a great one. Similarly, I've heard stories of women saying when they're like in a co-ed team at work, I'm always the one that is in charge of planning, making the reservation for a team dinner, or like, it's just assumed, even down to like getting the coffee for everyone before a meeting. Those things that we just assume a woman's gonna do, but really, where does that lie? Why are we making those assumptions? What's some examples? Anyone else before we go on?
Well, I
Yeah.
play a sport here, and obviously
Oh, great perspective.
the women's athletics aren't really taken as seriously as the guys. Like, we're not promoted nearly as much or anything, so.
100%. I wasn't involved in athletics when I was here, but you can tell, I remember hearing that like the women's locker rooms
Oh, yeah.
are very bad compared to the male
Yeah,
counterparts.
I have one too, kind of going along with that one. I guess like women usually aren't perceived to be capable of being as strong, whether it's physically or mentally, as men. And that
Mhm.
is,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like the ability to endure, like endurance and just resilience, and which I always find so ironic, because like we're the ones that give birth and we
Yeah.
have children and
it's them sobbing and whatever. Yeah, like, fine.
yeah, which is a whole nother conversation. But I really appreciate having both of your perspectives as current students and seeing that it's so true. Okay, now this is one that, again, you can feel free to raise your hand and share, or just reflect internally. Do you believe you are biased? Do you believe that you hold biases? With that caveat, this is really important to remember, and I'm gonna point to it in another slide soon, which is that being biased is part of being human. I know we're a little further away from the classroom than these two, but this is something I always remember, especially in sociology classes, of like recognizing that, the research behind this, how we all, sociology background, obviously like everything is a sociological construct, but recognizing that these biases are formed in the way that we experience the world, and that it's part of being human. And then it becomes, what are we doing to actively recognize that and combat those biases that we have? So this is the one that I'll ask for a quick share of our raise of hands for yes, no. So do you think that you could be biased against women in the workplace? Raise your hand for yes. Raise your hand for no. Okay, and then maybe I see a little yellow.
I don't know.
So we'll watch in the next video. I will preface the next video with me fully raising my hand and saying, yes, I am biased against women in the workplace, which you might say that makes you a really bad HR person, because how, do you have bias as an HR professional? But it's, again, we'll see in the next video that there is a similar story of an HR professional recognizing her own bias and then talking about what she does to combat it.
Okay, so let me just get this out there. I have a bias against women leaders. No one could be more surprised about this than me. I'm a woman leader. And on top, I even work in human resources, which means it's kind of my job to be unbiased. In fact, I passionately encourage women to step into leadership. My poor kids would definitely tell you I never stop talking. But in spite of my strong belief that women make great leaders, I realized I don't always act like it. Not long ago, within the same week, 2 members of my team asked me to take a look at their compensation. My first reaction to the man's request was something like, yeah, I'll look into it. My first reaction to the woman's request was something like, I'm pretty sure you're good. A day or so later, I'm sitting at my desk, hard at work, and I somehow connected what, up until then, I'd seen as 2 separate events. I'd had 2 very different reactions to basically the same request, and I thought, what's up with that? Might I be biased and not even know it? But I know what you're thinking. This is 2016. It's not a topic. Women leaders are everywhere. Maybe you, like me, have personally hired or promoted lots of women leaders. But then I thought, with all this talk of unconscious bias, might something be going on that I'm not even aware of, if it's unconscious and all? For those of you who might not already have been inundated with this in the corporate world, it's a simple concept and it's backed up by neuroscience. Our brain has to handle way too much information. So in order to manage it all, our brain takes the liberty of looking for patterns and filtering for us what it sees as the most important bits, like autopilot. Our brains take shortcuts. Without these shortcuts, we'd have to sit and really think through way too much information. Imagine if every single time you had to think through everything from how to open doors to how to shake hands to how to sing happy birthday. But brain shortcuts do have a downside because they see patterns that are based on the cumulative effect of everything you've been exposed to throughout your life. Which means the whole thing is happening also in the back of our minds, which means we're not even aware that it's happening. This can cause us to behave in ways that are not true to who we want to be or how we feel we are, and we might not even know it. Unconscious bias sounds kind of clinical, but I looked it up. And other words for unconscious are comatose, paralyzed, or senseless. And other words for bias are bigotry, intolerance, and unfairness. Okay, so that would mean we're not just unconsciously biased, we're actually senseless, intolerant bigots. So that's not something I want to be, consciously or unconsciously. And here's the scary part. Most of us think we can outsmart it. We believe it when we say things like, I don't see race, or I just hired the best person. It just so happened that at the time of the 2 pay requests, I was doing research on unconscious bias. And the research said, these are our expectations of men. We expect them to be assertive and strong and driven. And these are our expectations of women. We expect women to be helpful and sensitive and supportive. If we were to make it a little bit tighter, we see men as taking charge and women as taking care. No, it's not because every single one of us is a misogynist. It's simply because men taking charge and women taking care is what we've mostly been exposed to throughout our lives. And our brains will do the rest, unconsciously redirecting us into those patterns that it recognizes. Still feeling like this bias couldn't possibly belong to me, one of the words jumped out at me. Wait a minute. Do I see the man as a provider? And so I looked at his pay request more seriously? And do I not see the woman as a provider? And so I've somehow dismissed her request? In that moment, I had to realize I do. I see men as providers, but not women, which is really interesting because I'm the sole financial provider for my family of 6. My husband is a stay-at-home father for our 4 children. I take charge, and he takes care. I'm the last person I could imagine who could ever have a bias against women leaders, and yet I had to realize I have a bias against women leaders. I have a bias against myself. And if you're thinking, wow, bad on her. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one with this bias. The research shows that we all have a bias against women leaders. We just don't know it. I had both a man and a woman ask me for a raise at the same time, so I was confronted with my different reactions in real time. And I could notice it when I was accidentally treating people differently. Luckily, that happened, and I realized in time, but how many times have I not caught myself? How many times have you not caught yourself? So what's the antidote to being a senseless, intolerant bigot toward women leaders or anyone else? It's a big stretch to imagine that we'll always have the opportunity to cross-check our reactions with 2 different people in real life. But I realized we don't need to. We can't do this comparison mentally, and it's just as eye-opening. Just mentally flip whoever you're dealing with for someone else to test yourself. Like here, I made a slight change to this slide. I flipped the photos. Does anything on this slide feel weird? Flip it to test it. If it feels weird, you might want to check yourself. The more I tried it, the more I saw the value. In fact, there's this Twitter account that just flips the gender of things we commonly say, and suddenly they become funny. Being called a policewoman doesn't bother me at all because I know it covers both women and men. Andrew, policewoman, age 40. Or let's take my hometown baseball team of the Cleveland Indians. Flip it to test it. How would you feel to be up in the stands cheering for the Cleveland Caucasians? Now, maybe you're thinking, this doesn't happen to me. And maybe you're right. Maybe you are a superhuman person who manages to intercept those brain shortcuts at exactly the right moment to ensure you're behaving bias-free and consistently with your values and beliefs in all of your actions. It could very well be. But what have you got to lose to double check yourself? If we all started to flip it to test it, we might just be surprised at how often we would choose to behave differently. Because what if you're missing an opportunity to see the world differently?
Great, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so general reactions to that video. Was there anything from the video that surprised you at all? If so, what was surprising? Or did anything resonate? Were you nodding along at some parts?
Yeah, I'd say that I definitely have biases that I wouldn't have recognized until watching that.
Definitely. Anyone else?
I feel like even being a woman in like a powerful or like a managerial position, like you still have those biases against other women in those positions too. It's like you're in it, you still have that, so.
Mhm. Yeah, I've definitely experienced that myself because HR does tend to be like heavily female. So I've only had female managers in my professional roles. And still to this day, like even my manager and I, like the talking about exclamation points before, definitely resonated with me because I find myself checking and like trying to delete my exclamation points while worrying that I'm not seeming approachable as an HR person if I don't include at least one exclamation point. And in turn, if I get a message with just periods, which is like a fair, totally like the way you communicate, I find myself being like, wow, okay, dang. Like, all right, which is a bias I have and that I've had to learn to fix myself and then also, yeah, delete all of the exclamation points that I put in my communications and leave just one. So again, this big reminder that keeping in mind that being biased is part of being human. So it's really, you know, like being on Holy Cross campus makes me reflect about it is that like we are in a great position here. We start learning and training and going to classes to have that foundation to recognize our own biases. Not just if you took sociology classes, but I think in just learning if you're sitting in Kimmel one day and you're just sitting and observing and doing that flip it to test it. So really it's what takes us, it's this desire to change, that we need to recognize our biases that stay within ourselves. From the first video, you see how hard it can be, again, from that leader, HR leader, that she said herself, she's not supposed to have any biases, but was recognizing those. So in knowing that it takes us recognizing these to be able to combat them and recognize them, on the next slide, we'll learn about some common biases so that we can better recognize them. So if you go to yep, perfect. We're gonna watch, there are a few here that these are all within like a LinkedIn training that you can always point to, but these are on the Lean In organization webpage. And if you just scroll to, we're gonna start with one of my favorite topics, which is double discrimination and intersectionality. And then we'll go to maternal because that's another one that I've heard a lot about today.
Two quick reminders before I get started. First, people of all genders fall into bias traps, not just men.
Let's bring that way down. The base was like.
Audio, that's so good.
Second, knowing that unconscious bias exists isn't enough. We need to look for it and commit to take steps to counteract.
Oh my gosh, the
Women
base
of color
was
face
like-
bias
I feel like it's gonna fall out.
and LGBTQ women face biases for being women and biases for being LGBTQ. This compounded discrimination is significantly greater than the sum of its parts. Women of color are particularly underrepresented in the corporate pipeline behind white men, men of color, and white women. Compared to white women, women of color receive less support from managers, get less access to senior leaders, and are promoted more slowly. And Black women are particularly disadvantaged. This same dynamic holds true for LGBTQ. Research shows that lesbians have a harder time securing employment than women more broadly. According to one study, when a woman has something on her resume that indicates she's LGBTQ, for example, volunteering for an advocacy group, she's far less likely to get a callback. Many women experience even more biases and effects of discrimination. Imagine the compounding effect of being Asian, LGBTQ, and a woman. Or of being Black, Muslim, an immigrant, and a woman. Not surprisingly, research shows that people with 3 or more minority identities feel like they don't belong anywhere. It's important to note that men can also be held back by bias against their race, sexual identity, religious beliefs, age, or background. You'll see examples of double discrimination in our bias cards. The important thing is that we're all aware of the different biases people face, and we all commit to fairness and equality for everyone.
Okay, so that one's a great introduction to the concept of intersectionality, and then we'll just watch this one on maternal bias too.
Two quick reminders before I get started. First, people of all genders fall into bias traps, not just men. Second, knowing that unconscious bias exists isn't enough. We need to look for it and commit to take steps to counteract it. Motherhood triggers assumptions that women are less committed to their careers and less competent. It can intensify the performance bias that women already face. As a result, mothers are often given fewer opportunities and held to higher standards than fathers. We fall into the trap of thinking mothers are not as interested in their jobs now that they have kids. So we assume that they don't want that challenging assignment or to go on that big work trip. Because we think they're less committed, we're more likely to penalise them for small mistakes or oversights. Research shows that maternal bias is the strongest kind of gender bias. In one study, when PTA coordinator is added to a woman's resume, she is 79% less likely to be hired. She's half as likely to be promoted, and she's offered an average of $11,000 less in salary. Interestingly, maternal bias also starts early. As soon as women get engaged, they face pushback because we assume they're going to have children. And men face some pushback when they become parents too. Studies show that fathers who take time off for family reasons receive lower performance ratings and experience steeper reductions in future earnings than mothers who do. Now you know how maternal bias works. As a next step, you can use our bias cards to learn specific ways it shows up in the workplace and what to do about it.
Okay, awesome. Just two quick notes on my observations from my professional career, especially with those two, the intersectionality and maternal bias. Two places where I've heard of that come up just in speaking with other DEI professionals and even just hearing women in the workplace's experiences is that particularly when it comes to intersectionality, given all of the progress that has happened in the past 50 years, and especially the concept of diversity and inclusion being around even since the 60s, this is an area where we still aren't making strides as fast as we should be, especially when it comes to the pay inequities. When you look at pay across intersectional lines, and then particularly with the maternal bias, this is something that for anyone that is in the field of law, that's one example that I've heard is that particularly when it comes to partner track, you see a lot of women coming off of that pipeline when they choose to have families, which is something else that, you know, it not only DEI professionals, but everyone in the workplace, we need to be talking about to confront those and make those changes. So with that, a few questions. Anyone can, you don't have to raise your hand, you can just start chatting. Have you had any similar experiences in your career, or have you heard of anyone experiencing stereotypes or being disadvantaged? And that can be in the workplace, on campus. How do you feel about the experiences that you've heard people share before? And what are your general observations? Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I have both have experienced it and then there are people that have experienced it, and I usually just feel frustrated because I feel like I can't do anything about it because you can't change someone else's perspective, and like sometimes I feel frustrated that I can't be in their shoes and understand where they're coming from as hard as I try to.
Yeah, I think that brings up a great point of like, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is sometimes the experience, like sometimes it happens so quickly, or in an environment in which like you're processing what just happened to you and you don't have the opportunity to like, it's almost, you realize what's happened and then you don't have the time to go back and say, well, what did you mean by that? Like, what, can you say more? Why did you say that? What was your intention? Because you didn't want to say in the moment, or you realized it settled with you like after the interaction happened. So that's a really great call out. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Tara?
So I was talking about my coworker about this the other day because she has kids and a family and I don't. So we were both traveling for work and it was like, we were talking about like the different ways that we approach work travel. So like she feels like she has to do it because she's a parent. Like when she came back from maternity leave the first time, she felt like very pressured. Like if she didn't go on a work trip, then she wouldn't have future experience, like opportunities to do so. And then from like the non-kid perspective, I often feel like people are like, oh, well, I have a family, so I can't do this. And so it like falls to people who don't have families. And so it's like an interesting balance because I respect that the fact that they have families, but it's like finding that equity across the company.
Yeah. And I love your example because it shows that like both things can be true. It's usually not like either or. It's like your coworkers' feelings were valid and yours are valid. Why are all eyes going on me when it comes to work travel? Because I'm like the young one, you know, without a family. And then alternatively, why do I feel like I need to go if I just came back from leave? Do I feel like it's going to show up in my performance review that I'm not a team player for not going? So that's another great example. Thank you. Anyone else before we go on?
Yeah, my new job, I did have someone when I joined who she went on maternity leave. And she was supposed to be gone for I think 3 months. And then we were in like a big meeting and all the managers of my team and the CMO, they're all women and they all have kids, which I think is very interesting. But we were in one meeting and someone was asking like, oh, like what's the date she's coming back? And her boss, who's a woman who has kids, said, oh, like unfortunately, like it's getting delayed a little longer. And I think her even kind of saying that in front of a group was a little bit negative because you're kind of saying like, oh, it's putting us in a bad position because your employee is taking longer to come back. But so I feel like that was kind of a little bit of judging on her manager's end because she was going to come back like a week or two later than the agreed upon like maternity leave date. So I think that's the most kind of like maternal bias like I've recently seen in the workplace. And it was so small, like it was one sentence that she said, but this was like a couple of weeks ago and I'm still like remembering it.
Yeah, that's another great point. The fact that you're still remembering it after it happened, I think shows like, then it's the fear when we see it happening to others of, oh, is this the kind of culture or company environment that would support that? Because I feel like, especially, you know, post-pandemic, we are at this place and just seeing in the news everything that's happening, like like Elon Musk Twitter fiasco and like complete nightmare of like, you know, reversing the work from home policy or even just, I've heard stories within my HR career of like a male HR leader. So like you are the one that influences benefits, all of that, not letting someone within his HR team take an extra week of maternity leave. And it's just all of these stories that you hear that leads you to, especially in this post-pandemic era where we're looking for a more human element to leadership, where a lot of workers are holding their leaders accountable. So, you know, even given the situation we're in now, we're hearing about, I work in tech, so especially hearing about the layoffs in tech, you still see people choosing to leave jobs because they don't, you know, they don't vibe with the perspective that leadership shares and the culture that's created within that. So I appreciate you all sharing your perspectives because I think it permeates every type of workplace in some way or other. And you may you may see some of that on campus as well. So thank you all for sharing.
I also feel like,
No, you're still, yeah,
I
please.
also feel like, I've noticed at work that the women on my team are like often asked to do more stuff. It's like not in our job responsibilities, like helping with interviewing, like helping with onboarding, like doing mentorship programs, and all that stuff is hugely beneficial to the company. But then when it comes down to like career progression, like if somebody has spent, you know, 20 hours a month doing stuff that's like not inside their traditional job responsibilities, like that's taking 20 hours away from the
Yeah.
stuff that is. And I related to like the compounding effect, like I feel like my coworkers that are women of color are also asked to do a lot of like DEI initiatives, and a lot of them are thrilled to do the DEI initiatives and they're the ones leading them. But I think for a lot of other people, like they would just prefer to do their job, you know, and like not have to have that like extra work on top of the work that they're supposed to be doing, because everybody else is just being reviewed off, you know, the traditional job responsibilities.
Totally. I love that you brought that up because this is another important conversation that's come up in a lot of companies, is that how are we, you know, when it comes to like performance review time, putting in the extra work, sitting on a DEI council, doing all of these extra things that aren't considered part of your job. And then when it comes to performance review time, not recognizing those things, that's the time where you can monetize, where you can give spot bonuses for putting in the extra work, where you can give just like merit increases for that work that you're doing. So taking the shift from like looking at your performance as just driving the bottom line at your job versus like, what are you doing? What are you contributing to the company culture? And how can we compensate you for that? Because yeah, no one wants to do unpaid labor, which with that phrase, I feel like I'm just back in a sociology class. That unpaid labor that you're doing, that's taking away. And so that's definitely a great point. Thank you. These are some tips on, you know, unbiasing responses, especially, you know, if you find yourself, we'll go through a situation example in a second. But keeping your responses short, simple, and firm, asking questions. So usually like if you ask why, a lot of the times if you'll hear just like a blanket statement made or something, usually if you just ask why, someone will be able to give a response because then they don't know why they're saying that. Appealing to logic. Obviously, we don't all have like statistics just like ready to go and fire away. But it can even just be from like appealing to logic in a sense of like empathy, avoiding blame and focusing on the situation, and using I statements. So I feel this, I think this, from my perspective, this is how this landed. Those are all great ways to show, you know, it's all about that interconnectedness and how we all experience each other. And then avoiding humor, because usually it does tend to backfire. And avoiding humor, particularly, again, in this remote world. Now we might not hear things in person anymore, but it might be a Slack message that was read a different way than someone typed it out, an email or a comment made in a virtual Zoom meeting. Other tips for unbiasing responses, taking that moment to reflect. Again, sometimes when these situations arise, we don't have the time, and we're also struggling to think of what the most authentic way to react is to us. I myself, this row of women in front can tell you, I tend to be non-confrontational. So it's like, how is that approach? How can you still get your point across while being non-confrontational? Deciding if you want to intervene or ask clarifying questions. And some of these responses might help you if you keep these in the back of your head. So you can divert, change the conversation topic, address publicly in the meeting after the meeting, pulling someone aside or shooting them a Slack note, and then addressing in a private manner. So sometimes, again, you might not feel comfortable. You might not have the psychological safety in that moment to address it because you yourself might be worried about retaliation. I've seen that before in the workplace. So then it comes down to addressing privately, really focused on like this intent, because I think that's the thing that sometimes it comes up with asking that why. you know, you're curious about what their intent was in making that comment. And recognizing that that didn't land that way with me. So if you were intending to make joke or make light of something, it didn't land that way with me. I found it to be offensive and not conducive to our company culture. All right, so now we're wrapping up here a little bit. We'll look at an example scenario together. So if we go to the next slide, this is something that we've kind of already talked about in conversation. You come up to that performance review time, you're on a review committee, and several members argue against a woman's promotion because she's not seen as a leader, even though her team delivers outstanding results consistently. So how would you address this? The direct quote that you might hear would be, "I'm not sure. Adrianna doesn't exactly seem to show the leadership qualities we're looking for." So before we go to the next slide, ideas, thoughts, what would you say to combat this bias?
Like you said earlier, try to hash it out, like what kind of leadership qualities are we looking for here?
Yeah, that's a great.
I also feel like talking about the specific outstanding results is important, like. I feel like metrics, like even though they probably shouldn't come into play as much as like they do sometimes, like I feel like pointing out like, you know, her team delivered X last quarter and like X this year, and you know, on top of that, like what more would you be looking for?
Yeah, metrics, that's a great one. So both things that you said show up in here. So awesome job at putting those out. Drawing that attention to how the woman and her team delivered through strong performance. So examples, and how this is a demonstration of her effectiveness as a leader. So asking those questions, well, what do you define as a leader? And then it's as simple as like showing the receipts. Like it doesn't even have to be something that is, you know, again, tied to the bottom line. It can be something like showing those examples of like, you know, sitting on a panel, putting in that extra work, those things that go unrecognized because they're not tied to a specific key metric. But in the longer term solutions, we do see that having detailed metrics does help in the long run, particularly in terms of setting an even playing field. Because if you're holding every person accountable to the same standard, especially when it comes to like job descriptions or, you know, career mapping and succession planning, like if you have that list and those metrics, and then if you start to see a pattern where certain genders or certain races are being categorized one way and then others are being categorized another way, then it's time to re-examine and say, well, then what biases lie within these metrics and what are we doing to combat those biases? So they can help guide where we're at in confronting those biases. So this is, oh no, that's perfect. You can go there, it's fine. So it wouldn't be like a Holy Cross closing without a call to action, which is that hopefully in this conversation, I appreciate you all for sharing your perspectives today, is that we can all take away that one action that we'll do to address gender biases in the workplace or the campus community. And now I hope that you have a better idea of how to call out your bias and support yourself and your peers. I hope that you continue working on your own biases and responses to observing them in your workplace and campus and making them more equitable workplaces or campus communities. I will say being back in Hogan, it's great to see, like, especially the posters of the conversations that continue to happen. So I definitely encourage you to go to those. Learning doesn't just happen in the classroom. There's a whole place to learn from here. And then if we go to the next slide, those of us that aren't on the campus community anymore, there are still additional ways to learn and to continue to hear these conversations. Even if your workplace doesn't support, maybe they don't have the structure to have like employee resource groups or have robust DEI commitments and councils. HBR Women at Work is a great podcast. They talk about a lot of taboo topics that people usually aren't comfortable talking about, depending on what level of awareness in the DEI world that each company is at. So that's a great spot, you know, if you're ever taking like a walking break or something, or even just like your morning, opening up your laptop and checking out your emails before meetings, that's a great one to listen to. The employee resource groups, again, different organizations have different levels of support and money, really, it comes down to be able to like host events and put on events and even have like trainings for awareness. Books, if you love reading a good book, this is a new one that just came out. The literature on, you know, women in the workplace. It tends to be, even that video is from 2016 and like so much has probably changed since then. In the way that we approach thinking about deconstructing conscious and unconscious biases. So books are a great way to go to. I wish I read more than I do. Honestly, I tend to go the podcast route myself. And then again, just a reminder of Holy Cross, the campus where we are, for current students, that you do have this great opportunity to like take the classes. You know, this isn't a push for everybody to take a sociology class, but take the classes in the liberal arts degree that you might not usually take. Go to the conversations that your first feeling might be discomfort, because really this is such a ground where you can learn a lot from being in a place with, you know, people from different backgrounds and different lived experiences. That's it. I think, oh gosh, okay, yeah, just 2 minutes left. Sorry, I meant to leave like 15 minutes for questions, but any questions? Thoughts? Yeah.
So I've only taken an intro to social class here, but I loved it. So do you have like a favorite social class you took at Holy Cross?
Yes. Well, intro was because I took it freshman year. So it was probably the gender class I took. I never took which was one of my big regrets, our race class. I know Tara did. Yeah, that was a great class. But a taste of what I got from the same professor that taught it, which as a college athlete, we had a lot of college athletes in my class that took it, was college sports. I can never watch. I can't watch like college sports the same. That's the only thing about social classes is like, it kind of feels like you have blinders on and then you're taking off the blinders. I took a social TV and media class too. And then I found myself, it was hard to watch TV after two without thinking of the difference. So, but they're great. It's that, you know, it's always like underlying there. So it's like, you take the class and you're learning a lot about different ways that it's something that you just used to assume. The gender one is great. I don't know how they teach them. There used to be one about like families. I took one on aging. So there's a lot. Sometimes you have to be within the major to take it. But like there are a lot of good psychology classes too. I didn't take a lot of those. And even just like interdisciplinary ones that are really great, would recommend. But intro is perfect because then depending on the professor you have, you get like a flavor of a little bit of everything.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. That's why I was like, yeah, try to take another social class. before.
Yeah, awesome. Anything else?
Do you ever find yourself overwhelmed by how much like negativity comes from learning about the realizations in society?
That is I love how essential that is. I really love how essential it is because like it is like especially within the world of DEI, it's really hard sometimes to like watch things play out in real life. You're like, oh, I've heard this happen at other companies, but like we would never do that here. Like one example I'll give is that like I program managed an inclusive leadership development program, and like we were finding leaders to do it, and it was the most vocal leader who was like a white male that was like, he was like, I'm so gung ho, I love diversity and inclusion, like, I'm ready to have a protege, we called them, instead of like mentor. And like, he was the first to like not show up to the meetings, like not, so that's one small example. Yeah, looking at the news every day, like everything that's going on with Twitter right now is really disturbing and really disheartening to watch. But I mean, that exists. Like, I think I tend to be more of an optimist, especially like being back on campus, and like, I'm not that far away. We graduated less than 10 years ago, but just to see how like our generation is talking about these concepts and realizing that our generation is closer to, I think, like recognizing and calling out certain things. That is what gives me hope and optimism that like, hopefully it doesn't take another 50 years to see significant change across like pay equity across gender and racial lines, and different lines of intersecting identities. That's just my hope. I'm optimistic that it won't take that much quicker to get there. Sometimes it does feel like we're talking about these things all the time and nothing's changing. But I try to be optimistic and like look at the future generations and just look at and see, you know, that there is hope. So yeah. And to have the community and environment of like some days when you are just like, everything sucks and I hate it. If you have the community of people around you that can be like, let's talk about it, or like or just have a shoulder to like lean on and talk about. That's how I've gotten through it in the workplace, is like having the psychological safety with your manager or with a coworker, to just talk about stuff candidly and honestly.
I'm not like a negative person. My roommate's a social major, and sometimes she was like, Sydney, I wish I could just like put the blinders back on and wish I knew less. So
yeah,
that's
it's
why
so
I'm
true.
so-
No, it's so true.
Yeah.
I once thought I was like, oh, maybe I can do a PhD in sociology. I was like, I can't do that. I will never be able to look at anything the same way again. But at the same time, like we need people that are always calling things out, because there are definitely things that I recognize even just like a few years away from being off campus, that like I would have been quicker to call out or identify when I was in an environment where we were constantly talking about these things, versus like being in the workplace where it's just like an add-on instead of an everyday conversation. And so I've caught myself sometimes being like, man, if I would have been so much quicker to like call this out or identify it. When I was a college student. And then it sometimes can feel like it gets watered down in the workplace. So I think it does take, sometimes like colleagues and everything to like, they come from a different lived experience than you do, and then they can call it out, and then you can be like, yeah, you're right. This isn't right, or this didn't land well.